Steadfast in the winds of change, our band of tigers shall remain, proud and strong together through it all. Wherever in the world we roam, our hearts and minds keep coming home to six majestic columns standing tall. Yeah, they stand for one Mizzou, one Mizzou, forever one Mizzou. Where the colors shout the chorus, M-I-Z, see the new frontier before us, Z-O-U. You and I, black and gold on high, on the battlefield of old Faroe, in Jesse's hallowed halls we know, the quest to be the best is never done. No quarter ask, no compromising, headed to the new horizon, one for all and all for one Mizzou, one Mizzou, one Mizzou, forever one Mizzou.
Hello, Mizzou. We're talking to you.
Welcome to the family of the Southeastern Conference.
Then, now, always, one Mizzou.
Straight ahead with flags unfurled. M.I.Z. Tradition meets the brand new world. Z-O-U. One Mizzou, forever one Mizzou, forever one Mizzou, one Mizzou,
Forever.
one Mizzou,
Forever.
one Mizzou.
You may be curious why I would start a presentation of the possible legacy of the Morrill Act of 1862 with a new video entitled One Mizzou. Apart from the fact that I really like the lyrics and the melody and it's a high energy effort, the most important reason for starting with the video is to highlight the dramatic difference between what a modern land-grant university looks like today and to characterize it from the humble beginnings of our nation's land-grant colleges and universities, and the University of Missouri in particular. My name is Tom Henderson, and it is a privilege to share a few thoughts about the 150th anniversary of passage of the Morrill Act and its continuing legacy. Truth be known, I suspect there are not an insignificant number of you in this audience that may never have heard of or cared to bother about the implications of something that took place so many years ago. You are appropriately watching this video as you deal with challenges and opportunities to prepare yourself for the future. But it may not be such a bad idea to take a few minutes to reflect on the legacy of actions taken 150 years ago when Abraham Lincoln was president of this country. Given the hundreds of pages embodied in much of today's federal legislation, Section 4 of the Morrill Act, as sponsored by Senator Justin Morrill of Vermont, represents a remarkably succinct yet transforming document for the ages. The Land Grant Act was a politically explosive act, and it was opposed by most Southerners and blocked until the succession acts leading up to the Civil War allowed a coalition of Northern and newly admitted Western legislators to prevail after 8 years of unsuccessful efforts to pass the legislation. Section 4 of the Morrill Act, in this paragraph that I have before you, sets the stage in simple language for the creation of our land grant system of colleges and universities. Pardon me for reading, but I want to be specific. As stated, by each state which may take and claim the benefit of this act, to the endowment, support, and maintenance of at least one college, where the leading object shall be, without excluding other scientific and classical studies, and including military tactics, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the education of the working classes in the several pursuits of life and professions in general. Just as an aside, inclusion of the three words including military tactics was a huge issue when considering the country was in the depths of the Great Civil War, and the fact that it later led to the establishment of what we now know as ROTC on our campuses. I think those aforementioned words represent one of the 5 most significant pieces of national legislation ever enacted in our country on behalf of higher education. With passage of the law came the means to sell federal lands in support of each state that chose to proceed. One could think that it would be a forthright step and easily accomplished to implement this new legislation. Our history in this state often has shown us that agreement rarely comes easily, lest we easily might forget that we live in Missouri or Missouri, as you choose. That simple linguistic distinction says much about ourselves as Missourians. Our colleague, Dr. Darrell Hobbs, often reminded me that the state is where the North meets the South and the East meets the West. What exactly did the University of Missouri in Columbia look like some 150 years ago? To author Frank Stevens, 118 students were enrolled in 1861 at the University of Missouri at the outset of the Civil War. That number included some 50 primary students and 14 students who received agricultural diplomas, which we would liken today to a credit certificate rather than a full diploma. By 1861, a regiment of federal troops established living quarters in Academic Hall. And by early February 1862, Academic Hall was also used as a prison to hold Southern sympathizers. War-related incidents that continued to plague the campus ranged from an attempted burning of the president's vacant home in late August 1862 to the Union Army commanders, interestingly, forbidding the shooting of feral pigs on the campus, while at the same time ordering a particular Southern spy that had been seen on campus to be shot. By 1862, the July of that year, the university's fiscal balance was a princely $45.76, and it possessed a debt of $7,000. During 1861 and 1862, the Board of Curators actually conducted its work illegally, since getting a quorum was nearly impossible. Think about getting a majority of then 18 curators rather than 9 curators together in the midst of a civil war and in the lack of adequate roads and rails to be able to gather in the first place. Facing overwhelming challenges, the Board of Curators finally on March 23, 1862, voted to close the university. The curators fired the faculty and tried to obtain payments for the damage caused by the occupation of federal troops. At that point in time, the university received no state appropriation and tuition was virtually non-existent. The university's $123,000 endowment was also tied up by the state of Missouri as collateral to pay for the war effort. Could it get much worse? The University of Missouri did reopen about this time in the year 1862 and spent the rest of the war years, as author Stevens noted, convalescing. By this time, 150 years ago, the university had reopened. The Morrill Act had passed and all were ready to proceed. Not really. Didn't I just say earlier we lived in Missouri or Missouri? If one visualizes the geography of our nation, land grant status accrued to most existing state colleges and universities east of the Mississippi River. At that time, the West was still opening up. There was a hue and cry for the new universities for the working classes to be new agricultural and mechanical universities. Not very far beneath the surface was the hope by some northern leaders that an educated working class of farmers and rural citizens would reject further the efforts to expand slavery in these new states and territories. Look at the tapestry of land-grant universities west of the Mississippi, and you could see the new universities emerging in places such as Iowa State, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, Texas A&M, and the Dakotas, and on and on. Well, what does one do in Missouri where you have an existing university that already existed west of the Mississippi? Well, it only took 8 more years for the state legislature to resolve this issue of where to place the land grant, and it will shock you to know that only a political deal struck at the last moment in 1870 resolved the fight. What was the big problem? The Civil War was the big problem, and the fact that Columbia was right in the middle of Little Dixie with many Southern sympathizers, including faculty serving as Confederate soldiers fighting for the succession. Feelings remained high among the Northern victors, and they saw no reason to reward a community without even a railroad and an institution of higher learning for its wayward ways during the conflict. Over the course of 8 years, efforts such as the one in 1867 were made to establish what we would call a technical university in Missouri. Think Georgia Tech University today. By 1868, efforts had also been made to locate the agricultural college either in the St. Louis area, Springfield, or the mining area of southeast Missouri. Finally, just as federal deadlines for action approached, a legislative deal was struck in February 1870. Were not such a deal successfully closed, this year's conference might have been held in one of several other locales. At the beginning of my remarks, I pointed out the Morrill Act being what I believe to one of the single most important pieces of legislation ever to be passed. Its legacy is above all about access and the democratization of higher education for the residents of our country, and in this state in particular. The other 4 important legislative initiatives that I believe positively resulted in the legacy of access are the Second Morrill Act of 1890, which afforded African Americans new and expanded opportunities, the Smith-Lever Act establishing the cooperative extension system, the GI Bill following World War II, and the educational amendments of 1972, which are better known as Title IX, which is related to opportunities for women in higher education. I'm sharing this remaining PowerPoint presentation not as the official history of extension in Missouri, but as a reflection of my research, the research of a retired extension colleague, Ms. Vicki Whitworth, newspaper accounts, and my personal observations related to changing extension efforts in Missouri. As already indicated, Extension's foundation was originally set in place by that cornerstone passage of the Morrill Act of 1862. One could spend an entire presentation on that topic alone. But as I said before, it suffices to say the Morrill Act, for whatever its sponsors' motives were, serves as the greatest legacy of public higher education in this country. Subsequent federal legislation established the Hatch Act of 1887 and the Second Morrill Act of 1890. That further set the stage for extension work by creating a support system for agricultural research and the expansion of land grant status to historically black colleges and universities. Lincoln University in Missouri was designated as one such 1890 institution. Many people would presuppose today that the earliest extension work at the university had its origins in the federal Smith-Lever Act of 1914, which serves as the statutory basis for the cooperative extension system. In fact, the earliest extension work in Missouri occurred in the late 19th and early 20th century through the University of Missouri's College of Education. From its earliest identification in 1869 as a normal department and the forerunner of subsequent normal colleges in Missouri, the college led the movement to strengthen support for training elementary and secondary teachers in Missouri and particularly rural counties. The internet delivery of that period was the train, and teaching classrooms were in rail cars. By parking those rail car classrooms along local spurs, the college took teaching and learning through extension to the people in rural communities. As early as 1897, there was a standing committee for extension work on the Columbia campus. The campus was providing non-credit courses in Kansas City and elsewhere. That model was subsequently replicated successfully by cooperative extension faculty after 1914. By 1910, the first extension division was established at MU as the 10th division of the campus. By 1912, the roots of cooperative extension movement were taking hold in Missouri with the naming of the first county agent. By 1914, 7 counties headquartered extension faculty known as county agents. You can see the first agents were all men, and a broad range of academic and educational expectations were tied to their jobs. Passage of the Smith-Lever Act set in place a national delivery system that reflected an extension mission at the University of Missouri and other land grants. In those earliest years, home economics and boys and girls clubs also became the fabric of extension work. With that expansion of mission and attention to new areas of emphasis, eventually came the hiring of women. By today's understanding of extension work, the challenges for the early extension educators look distant and far removed from today's world. Efforts to stem hog cholera, the need to bring rural electrification to farm families and communities, and the effort to increase livestock and crop production from woeful levels are but a few examples of bringing university-based research efforts to the working classes. As America was drawn into World War I in 1917 and 18, the extension mission was again refocused on supporting the war effort, in particular areas such as increasing vegetable gardening, as well as preserving and canning of those crops to support the war effort. It bears noting that in pre-World War II years, the employment of female agents in Missouri was initiated within extension. While I'm sure the female agents were self-sufficient in their own minds, the agents still faced the reality of losing their employment upon marriage and needed to travel with the county agent at all times, the male county agent, I might add. While the extension world has obviously changed in many ways, it's interesting to note that the first annual conference of Missouri Cooperative Extension Agents in 1915, the 2 biggest issues identified by the agents, all 7 or so of them, were 1, low pay, and 2, too much campus faculty directed programming. I will let each of you decide how much some things have changed or not over the years. As previously indicated, the mobile classrooms of the earliest years were rail cars parked on local train spurs. They were supplanted by other distance education strategies over the decades that ranged from automobile travel, faculty flying in university airplanes to teach in rural communities in particular, to today's web-based digital teaching platforms of the World Wide Web that include e-extension. The hallmark of extension education has always been grounded in the practical application of research in day-to-day settings of Missouri residents. Field demonstrations in agriculture and the formation of girls' sewing clubs and other similar efforts that led to our current 4-H programs are but 2 examples of taking extension education to the home and the community. Board of Curators action in 1910 established that first General Extension Division. Since that time, the brand identity of University Extension's efforts in continuing education, distance education, engagement, cooperative extension, and other allied efforts have encompassed at least a half a dozen names over the decades. Attempting to brand a broad-based mission with an annual budget of approximately $83 million is analogous to the same challenges facing a large corporation that's better known by its sub-brands. All too often, Extension is known by its 6 program areas of agriculture, business development, community development, continuing education, human environmental sciences, and 4-H youth, than by its current brand name, University of Missouri Extension. In my mind, the most important question that comes up in these types of discussions is whether Extension is an organization or a mission of the university. My personal answer to that "or" question has always been yes. It is both a named brand entity for a critical academic unit of the University of Missouri, but more importantly, it is a mission partner with teaching, research, and economic development. With the onset of the Great Depression and subsequently World War II and the Korean conflict, the need for effective and efficient agricultural practices were foremost issues in rural America, and Extension was the primary delivery mechanism for these far-reaching research efforts with Missouri farm families. With ever-changing weather challenges in the state, across the country, and indeed the world, the need for extension interface remains vitally important. In the midst of this research and extension renaissance, a 1957 national study was convened by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to study the cooperative extension system. The study's goal was to examine the future mission and organization of the extension system across the country. One of its most noteworthy participants was Dr. C. Bryce Ratchford from North Carolina State University. The findings of that study, coupled with the key hire at that time of Dr. Ratchford in Missouri, changed the course of extension history in Missouri. With the hiring of Dr. Ratchford as Vice President for Extension Missouri came someone who possessed a broad vision of extension that was outlined in the 1957 study. During his tenure as Vice President and subsequently President of the University of Missouri system, change became the order of the day. Just a few of the seminal changes that were implemented during those years are enumerated on this PowerPoint slide. These administrative and academic program changes may seem mundane some 50 years later, but they were culture changing at that point in time. As an aside, there are many land-grant universities some 5 decades later that are still struggling to replicate some of these administrative and program changes in the face of an ever-changing world. 50 years ago, a single administrative structure for extension and continuing education was created on the campus. Unlike many universities where duplicative administrative structures still exist, the University of Missouri's single centralized oversight structure avoids costly redundancy and administrative costs. By having those administrative costs of 3% and statewide program costs of 6% of a total budget of more than $83 million, Extension in Missouri is able to maximize its commitment to educational efforts. The idea of extension faculty anchored in academic units, the creation of multi-county faculty assignments and program delivery, and what were new programming efforts in business development and community development are still challenges for many of today's land-grant systems. By the early 1970s, the traditional extension funding mechanism began to evolve from the metaphor of the three-legged stool of federal, state, and county funding. Today, Extension Missouri can easily be seen as being supported by at least a five-legged stool that now includes not only the important original funding partners, but subsequently benefits from the addition of more than $28 million in annual grants and contracts and $26 million in continuing education, fees, sales, and services. A sixth stool of funding is emerging on behalf of Extension and a growing gift and endowment stream that totaled $303,000 in revenue in 2012 from a total summary giving of more than $3.1 million. Just as its parent institution has completed a relatively recent multi-year $1 billion campaign, Extension is now supporting its long-term future through its new partnership with Extension donors. An important feature of the past 4 decades of Extension work has been tied to the development of urban campuses in St. Louis and Kansas City, as well as extending academic bases through Missouri S&T at Raleigh and working cooperatively with our 1890 institution, Lincoln University. The unique needs of residents, taxpayers in urban areas continues to challenge Extension and all its cooperators in the most effective strategies and programs to meet the needs of 2/3 of the state's population. Over its long history, University Extension has always been faced with the need to initiate change as a reflection of changes in the lives of Missourians. While contentious at times, changes resulted in continuous organizational renewal. Extension's mission has served Missourians well over time, but the means and strategies to accomplish its mission is reflective of the statement that the only real constant is change itself. 5 of the many possible issues associated with change are identified in the presentation to remind us that Extension can expect to face future yet unnamed issues as it evolves as the primary representation of the engaged flagship institution of the state of Missouri. In recognition of celebrating this wonderful legacy of the Morrill Act, I hope I've contributed in a small way to an understanding of the 150 years of history that serve as the foundation for where University of Missouri Extension and each of you are today. While history is sometimes contextually remote, our predecessors made this gathering possible for the work that you will address in the conference and beyond. It is also the reason that Extension will always be the best evidence of relevant and continuing legacy of the Morrill Act. In a country where we are beset by obesity and hunger at the same time, where changing global patterns threaten current food and fiber production patterns, where communities face instances of crumbling physical and social infrastructure, where small entrepreneurs struggle to find financial capital to build their companies, and where the fabric of family and youth are under day-to-day pressure, the need for extension remains as relevant as ever. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts with you about the Morrill Act, its legacy of University of Missouri Extension, and its relevance for today and tomorrow. Please know that University Extension will always be a special part of me.